I was asked to give a set of readings for you, and I did. And I am going to assume that you have done or will do those readings. So I'm not going to talk about what's in the readings. Okay, what I'm going to do is to to illustrate the argument in the readings. The readings are, well, they really focus on the nature of the colonial state. But I want to talk a little more broadly about the nature of the state in colonized places, particularly Africa. When one speaks about the nature of the state in Africa, there are certain presumptions, preconceptions one runs into and against. The most important presumption, prejudice, I would say, because it's not an informed view. But the most important one is the assumption that organized political power did not exist in Africa before colonialism. And if it did exist, then it must have been brought from the outside. In the study of Rwanda, this is known as the Hermetic hypothesis. This assumption is so widespread. How many of you have read Guns, Germs, and Steel? A very interesting book, but with some problematic assumptions. And the assumption on Africa in Guns, Germs, and Steel is precisely this, that there was no organized political power in Africa, no indigenously organized power prior to external, mainly European presence on the continent. The second assumption is that the beginning of organized political life, the beginning of a possibility of law and order, is the colonial period. The third assumption is that the reason for the proliferation of ethnic conflict around the continent after independence is that colonialism ended too soon. Colonialism should actually have continued and finished its job. That's the third assumption. These are widely held assumptions. I'm not caricaturing. Sometimes they tend to be held not even consciously, which is more serious. Today, currently, in the present-day American imagination, the example of this is Darfur. Right? That's the example. So what I want to do today is to talk about the state, but in the very specific context of Sudan and Darfur. And I want to talk about it historically. I don't know how long it'll take, but everybody is allowed to vote with their feet. If mine give way, I'll just sit down. But I'll try and make a coherent argument. That's what I'm saying. Okay. So it'll take a bit of time. It'll take an hour and something. Give or take. Boy, you're wondering why you asked me to come. They wonder every year, and they ask me to come every next year. I don't know why. So that's what I'm going to try and do. Now, if you were in the University of Khartoum in Sudan, and you were studying history in that university, you would notice that there is a big gulf between academic history and popular memory. Right? Sudan, by the way, is the largest country in Africa. Right? It's roughly a third of the United States in its surface area. And Darfur is the size of France. Right? Not a small place. Roughly, I don't know about a third, but a good chunk of Sudan, but roughly the size of France. So if you were at the University of Khartoum and you were studying history, you would notice a gulf between academic notions of history and popular memory, between what people like you, educated, young persons, your sense of history, and what the man and the woman in the street, the history that they identify with. The academic notion of history in the university would trace the history of Sudan to about 6,000 years ago. To as far back as you can trace the pharaohs of Egypt. Because running alongside the history of ancient Egypt is the history of ancient Nubia. Periods in which Egypt conquers Nubia, but there are also periods in which Nubia conquers Egypt. And then that history is followed by centuries of the history of Christian kingdoms in northern Sudan. And it is about round about 1650, fairly recently, against the backdrop of this 6,000-year history, it's round about 1650 that you get Muslim kingdoms in Sudan. Two major Muslim kingdoms. The kingdom of Funj, with its capital at Sinar, and the kingdom of Darfur, the Sultanate of Darfur. The kingdom of Funj is the Nile Valley, come down south, and Darfur is to the west, on the Chadian border. So this academic person would have this long history in mind. The person on the street doesn't think of ancient Nubia as part of the history of Sudan. For that person, ancient Nubia is maybe part of the history of a particular group in Sudan, the Nubians. They don't think of the Christian kingdoms as part of the history of Sudan, because for the northerners, those were Christian kingdoms. What does it have to do with us? We are Muslims. And for the southerners, the southern elite, which is predominantly Christian, not ordinary population, but the elite which is predominantly Christian, even if they were Christian kingdoms, they were northern kingdoms. What does it have to do with us? For popular opinion in Sudan, the history of northern Sudan begins with these two sultanates, Darfur and Fanj. (1650) on, and this is a little earlier, but I'm going to concentrate on this. When the Sultanate of Darfur, first I want you to get a sense of a process of state formation in Africa before colonialism. This is way before colonialism. Right? Sultanate of Darfur, when it begins, 1650, the landscape is a series of chiefdoms, local, small scale. The Sultanate emerges amongst the four people. And its first problem is how to become autonomous of the chiefdoms, and then how to be a kingdom. How to become autonomous, then how to dominate over the chiefdoms. Otherwise, it would just be another chiefdom. How does it become a sultanate? How does it become a power over and above chiefdoms? An overarching power which first coexists with them and then dominates over them and incorporates them. Initially, the Sultanate has a moving capital. The king is afraid that the provinces will secede unless he moves camp from province to province. You can see it's still like a chiefdom. It's the establishment of a capital. In the early 18th century, around 1710, in El Fasher, today northern Darfur, that signals that the key institutions for a centralizing power are in place. So I want to begin with the discussion of those institutions. What are the institutions on which this centralizing power is built? The first institution is a system of landed estates. Landed estates. This is known as the Hakura. There are two kinds of landed estates: administrative and special. The administrative landed estate is kind of a transitional phenomenon, meaning in part it's simply a recognition of the reality that existed, but in part it's something new. The something old is that these administrative hakura are landed estates that the king purports to grant to tribal chiefs. And in granting it to tribal chiefs, all the king is doing is acknowledging what they control. That's the old. But the new is that the king, part of the grant of the hakura is certain rights. Two kinds of rights. Right of exemption from taxes and the right to settle disputes. And with the administrative hakura, these rights are granted in part. So the king can levy some taxes. Some kinds of disputes will have to come to court. So the new part is that the power of tribal chiefs is being curtailed. Some of their power is being acknowledged, but some of it is being transferred to the court. The second type of hakura, special hakura, is the grant of landed estates to notables, court notables. And this is the dynamic element in the system. These grants are recorded in writing. They are there in museums. Hundreds of them are there. Historians read them and write about them. And these grants give more or less full exemption from taxation and full rights to settle internal disputes. These grants are almost akin to individual property. If the first is a quasi-representation of tribal property, if the administrative hakura is a quasi-representation of tribal property, the special hakura is almost individual property. I'm trying to give you a sense of the dynamic element and how things were moving, as opposed to this notion of traditional Africa, where nothing changed. Right? There's no history until something happened from the outside. So that's the first institution. Now, who were these notables who got the grants? How did the court, where did the court get its officials? The first institution the court had to create was an army. Had to create an army. And if you are in a terrain with tribal chiefs, where will you get the army from? And the solution is to create an army from slaves. Right? Darfur is an enslaving power. It enslaves to the south. Southern slaves are brought to Darfur. Some of them are exported. The majority remain in Darfur. And they mainly go into the army. You have to keep in mind a distinction between pre-modern and modern slave trade. There's a similarity and a distinction. The similarity is that the capture is as brutal, whether it's pre-modern or modern. The wrenching, removal of the enslaved person from their home. But the difference is in where the demand is coming from. The demand for slaves in the pre-modern period came mainly from the state. There was domestic slavery, but it was small, mainly from the state. Even the early Roman Empire, not the army, but the administrative structure, recruited from slaves. Because simply, question of loyalty. Where are you going to get officials? If you get them from the chiefdoms, you're not sure of loyalty. Slave is removed from his, usually his, not her, his home environment, the one who's going to become an official. And for questions of loyalty, so slaves could rise to the highest positions. Tiny minority, but they could. So the second group are royal slaves. Royal slaves who are in charge of sections of the army and who are administrators, court officials who administer outlying areas, starting with pastoralists, but then agriculturalists also. The slaves become so powerful in Darfur. You know, usually in a state, one of the most difficult questions is that of succession. Succession is the time where everything can fall apart. How do you ensure succession? Democracies, succession is the time they bring in the population. The population doesn't rule. It simply gets to decide who rules. Right? The idea that democracy is a government of the people, by the people is a little bit of public relations. But the population comes in at the time of succession. Who rules? 1803 is the last time there is it's the last time the question of succession is decided on the battlefield in Darfur. After that, it's decided by kingmakers. And the kingmakers are the leading royal slaves. The slaves who cannot rule, but who decide who will rule. Which of the princes will rule? I just want to digress a little bit to sort of clearly underline this point. Because the slaves of Darfur are being exported to Egypt. In Egypt, the Arabs conquer Egypt from Byzantine, 7th century. And the Arabs lose out within a century. They lose out. There are a succession of dynasties and powers that come in. The first important power which comes in are the Fatimids. But the important thing is, after the Arabs, every power that comes in wants to marginalize the Arabs, remove them from the army, and they create an army from slaves. Slaves imported, rival dynasties import slaves from different places. The Fatimid import slaves from the south, Nubian slaves. They're all called Nubian, wherever they are from in the south. The rivals import slaves from Turkey. The Mamluks. Egypt is a place where the slaves come into power. The Mamluks rule Egypt for several centuries. So we go back to Darfur. There are the royal slaves. Then there is Islam. The third institution is Islam. Because the ideology of the new centralizing power, the kingdom, the basis for a new loyalty, the ideology that will provide the basis for a new loyalty, a loyalty that will counter kinship, is religion, is Islam. But Islam will not simply provide a new basis for a new loyalty. It will also provide the instruments of literacy, because it will go hand in hand with Arabic. And literacy will make it possible to have an administration which is not simply a face-to-face administration. It will make it possible to have an expanding sultanate. As the sultanate expands, by the time we come to the end of the 19th century, only a third of the subjects of the Sultan are four. Only a third. Those who preach Islam, known as the Fuqura, the holy men, come mainly from West Africa. There are pilgrimages from West Africa to Mecca, starting around 11th century. The pilgrims are not only royal pilgrims, they are also ordinary men and women. Ordinary men and women who hoof it on foot. They work their way. Most of them never get there. Or if they get there, they never get back. Somewhere along the way, they work and they stay put. Historians estimate that by the end of the 19th century, minimum 30% of the population of Darfur are immigrants from West Africa. 30%. The Fuqura, we're talking of these special estates, these special Hakura. Who gets them? The royal slaves who are in leading positions in the army and in administration. The holy men, the Fuqura. When they get these landed estates with full exemptions, they pass on the exemption to their followers, which encourages further immigration. It is this estate system which is the basis of the Sufi brotherhood in Sudan. The Sufi brotherhood, which is kind of quasi-sovereign in a way. Not sovereign, strong word, but autonomous. The Sufi brotherhood is a semi-secular institution. Semi-secular in the sense that it is autonomous, but it has no aspirations for political power. It remains independent of political power. And the political power, the Sultanate, respects this independence, but knowing that the independence is a guarantee of its own power. Because secularism is said to be independence, but it really means going along with whoever is the power. That's secularism, right? If you oppose it, you compromise secularism. If you support it, you don't. That's the deal. Secularism is a deal whereby the state dictates the boundary and the terms of the relationship between the religious and the secular. So this is the new elite of Darfur. It's a new elite of Darfur. The Sultanate, its wealth, its expansion is based on a long-distance trade, which is first and foremost trade in slaves. Secondly, trade in camels, ostrich feathers, gold, and then there's internal trade. Ivory. The Sultanate collapses at the beginning of the 20th century. Collapses late 19th century. Collapses late 19th century because the slave trade collapses. Because the slave raiders on horses are defeated by the slave raiders with guns. Because the 19th century sees a phenomenal expansion of the slave trade in this part of Africa as plantation slavery is introduced into colonies in the Indian Ocean. It's introduced from Americas into French colonies, Seychelles, Réunion, and with a phenomenal expansion now for slaves, not only from the state, but now from the market, come European slaving companies. Darfur collapses. The new power. The new power, which in this history is known as Turkey. Turkey comes and conquers the kingdom of Funj, 1821, I think. It's called Turkey, but that's a misnomer. Turkey doesn't exist. It's the state of Turkey. It's Ottoman. It's Ottoman power, but increasingly with Egyptian and English connections. More and more English. The Turkey. Ottoman power, which gradually becomes a melange of Ottoman, Egyptian, increasingly English. Turkey begins by an assault on established centers of power. All tribal centers of power are under assault. The only section of the old elite which remains is the holy men, the Fukura. And it's not a surprise that the resistance to Turkey is led by the holy men. The resistance to Fukura comes from two centers. From around the Nile Valley, from where comes the Mahdi, and from Darfur, from the west, Darfur and Kordofan, from where comes his deputy, Khalifa Abdullah. the Mahdi means, well, the savior. Abrahamic religions are full of this notion of a savior who will arrive in. And at that period, which is the end of the Islamic century, West Africa, which is under assault by British troops, and the rumor spreads that the Mahdi is going to appear in the east, masses of people migrate to Sudan waiting for the Mahdi. Sure enough, the Mahdi appears, the son of a boatman on the Nile. The Mahdiya is a very contradictory phenomenon. Contradictory in the sense it's politically emancipatory and socially reactionary. And let me describe this a little bit. Politically, the Mahdiya targets the empire. The success of the Mahdi shakes centers of empire. London, Paris, Istanbul. They're astonished. When Gordon comes, he's killed, British troops are defeated. The Mahdiya rules for over a decade. The British had brought Gordon from China, Chinese Gordon he was called, fresh from successes in China. Then they bring in another outstanding champion of the empire, Kitchener. When Kitchener defeats the Mahdi's army, Mahdi dies the year the Mahdiya wins. Khalifa Abdullah heads the Mahdiya, the state. Mahdi is buried in the twin city of Khartoum, Omdurman. Above his tomb is a mausoleum. When Kitchener captures Omdurman, he breaks the mausoleum, desecrates the tomb, brings out the remains of the Mahdi, severs the head from the skeleton, throws the skeleton in the Nile, puts the head on his desk as an inkpot. The Mahdi has reduced the empire and all its pretensions to this act. It's not unusual for empires on the defensive to become obviously uncivil. Well, the Mahdiya manages to put together this force, but the Mahdiya is also extremely brutal against those who refuse to join it. The brotherhoods, the Sufi brotherhoods of Sudan, divide into two. Those around the Nile who drew their inspiration from Egypt look at Egypt as part of the ruling power, part of this coalition. Ottoman, England, Egypt, Turkey. They support the Turkey. Those who draw their inspiration from West Africa. The division is too neat. The Mahdi, after all, came from the Nile. But it does make some sense of what was at stake. So the brutality of the violence against those who don't join. At the same time, the socially reactionary aspect is that even though the Mahdiya talks of equality, within this notion of equality, there are very fixed notions of the role of men, women, children. And these notions will be put into practice with force if necessary. In my view, this combination of politically progressive and socially reactionary movements is a very common combination through the Third World as we come to the period of decolonization and anti-imperialism. when the British come back, when the Mahdiya is defeated, they're faced with the question of order, how to establish order. The British civil administration, the colonial state they established, goes through 3 phases. The first phase is a military phase, a period of pacification, a highly centralized phase of individual British officers involved in centralized rule. And they divide the brotherhoods, the Sufi brotherhoods, into the Mahdiya and the Khatamiya. Khatamiya is the pro-Egyptian. But then Egypt is changing. Egypt is changing, a nationalist movement is born in Egypt. Egypt is no longer just the king. Egypt is also a nationalist movement against the king. And that movement affects the Khatamiya. When British create a college, when they let in Sudanese into the lower ranks of the army, they confine this recruitment to the Khatamiya. But now the recruits from the Khatamiya are influenced by the nationalist movement in Egypt. In 1924, a rebellion happens in Sudan called the White Flag Rebellion, led by a southern Sudanese, a Dinka junior officer. And that's the turning point. It's the turning point at which the British now go through a 5-year brainstorming process. There are extremely interesting documents. They go through a 5-year brainstorming process on how to deal with this problem. They decide to seal off the South Closed Districts Ordinance and seal off parts of Darfur, and they begin with a new system, indirect rule. It's that system which, everything else is introduction. Now this is the main point. That system that I want you to get. That system, indirect rule, the British decide to re-tribalize Darfur. Remember, the Sultanate of Darfur is not a tribal affair. It's not a tribal affair. The 4 are a third. West African immigrants are another third. The other third are a host of ethnic groups. Even the elite of the Sultanate of Darfur is not from one ethnic group. The military elite, the administrative elite, is derived mainly from the slaves of the South, coming from different ethnic groups, but all lumped together, known as Fertit. The holy men, the Fukura, are mainly from West Africa. The traders are mainly from the Nile. It's a multinational cosmopolitan elite. Colonial power will create out of this multinational cosmopolitan elite and multi-ethnic population a tribalized power and a tribalized society. What does it mean? What does it mean to create a tribalized power and a tribalized society? It means the following things. It means, first of all, an administrative change, whereby the whole of Darfur will be administratively, I mean, it looks like New York, it's not quite a grid, but administratively will be divided into different tribal homelands. Dar. Dar is tribal homeland. Dar is an Arabic word. Its meaning before the colonial period is not tribal homeland. Its meaning is homeland. And homeland can be anything. Homeland is a location. It can be the place where you live. It can be the village you live in. It can be the locality you live in. It can be the country you live in. any location. It has multiple meanings. But with colonial power, Dar will come to mean tribal homeland. Not any other homeland, tribal homeland. Why? Because this system will have certain features. The tribes living in a Dar will be divided. One of them will be designated a native tribe. An indigenous tribe. And the others will be designated settler tribes, immigrant tribes. Your rights will depend on whether you are designated native or settler. It doesn't matter if you are 10th generation, 5th generation, whatever, it doesn't matter. If you're an immigrant tribe, your children are immigrants, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, everybody is. Your rights will depend on whether you are designated as native or immigrant. What are the rights? The key rights. 1, land. In this re-tribalized Darfur, there's no Hakura, or there's only one kind of Hakura. There's no special Hakura, no Hakura which is equivalent to individual property. The only property is tribal property. And tribal property is a customary right of the native tribe. If you are designated as a member of a settler or immigrant tribe, you cannot access land as a customary right. To access land, you must pay tribute to the customary authority. That's the first right. Right for native tribes, discrimination against non-native tribes. Second right has to do with governance. All disputes are solved by a native authority or native assemblies. If you are born in Darfur of a settler or immigrant tribe, you are involved in a dispute. That dispute, the resolution of that dispute will not involve you or your representative. It will be settled by a native authority or a native assembly. So the two are joined, land and participation in the public sphere, land and governance. This is a system of discrimination and privilege. Privilege for those designated native, discrimination against those not designated native. On the landscape of Darfur, this system will discriminate against pastoralists as opposed to peasants. But there are two kinds of pastoralists in Darfur. Darfur is like, in the middle is this mountain range, Jabal Marra. It's about 75 miles, mountain range. To the south, you have savanna, grassland. And to the north, you have sort of semi-desert and desert. So you have two kinds of pastoralists. In the north are camel pastoralists. In the south are cattle pastoralists. Cattle graze. Camels don't graze, they forage, right, on trees. There's nothing on the ground, right? It's the trees. The cattle pastoralists in the south are semi-nomads. They have villages. Women and children stay in these villages. The men go out seasonally with the cattle. They graze the cattle, they come back. The cattle nomads are discriminated against in the sense that their dar is limited to where they have villages, not where they graze. But the camel nomads have no villages. They are on the move. In a year, they move 1,000 kilometers from the north down south. So in this system, the camel nomads have no dar. One section of the population which has no tribal homeland. You can see that the system is set up to explode once the external conditions are right. It will explode. It will explode because in any crisis, those without a dar will be its first victims. And the crisis comes. The crisis comes from the 1960s onwards as the rains fail. It's 20 years before the rains come back to the original cycle in the 80s. The crisis also comes because there's a civil war in Chad, a 30-year-long civil war, because Chad is like Kivu in eastern Congo. I mean, Darfur is like Kivu in eastern Congo in the sense that if you go to Central Africa, anybody who loses in Rwanda goes to Kivu in central Congo. You organize, you arm, when you're ready, you come back to Rwanda. That's Darfur. Anybody who loses in Chad comes to Darfur. They arm in Darfur, they organize in Darfur, they're ready, they go. The government in power bombs Darfur, sends in militia soldiers into Darfur to chase opposition militia. Right. By the 1990s, Darfur has no water, but it's flooded with arms. A Kalashnikov is $40 in the marketplace. By the time you come to 2003, and the violence of 2003, 2004, Darfur has been in the midst of a crisis for at least a decade of violence. When you come to the crisis of 2003, 2004, and now I call on your memory and imagination, the word Janjaweed, you know it all, right? Janjaweed. The perpetrators of this horrific violence on civilian groups, who are the Janjaweed? The core groups among the Janjaweed come from two groups. One are the camel nomads of the north. Those who have no dar, those who have been pushed down south by the expanding, encroaching desert, who have no homeland, and who say that this notion of the land being the property of a tribe is not a notion we subscribe to. We subscribe to the notion that land belongs to the nation. The other group in the Janjaweed are refugees from Chad, who also have no dar, who have also been driven by the drought and the violence. My point is simply to direct your attention to how power gets reorganized in the colonial period, how that reorganization distinguishes between two kinds of ethnic groups, native and non-native, with relative privileges for the native group and discrimination against the non-native group, so that with any crisis, the conflict is bound to take on an ethnic form. The point is, of course, African notions of ethnicity are much older than colonialism, much, much older. But the politicization of ethnicity, at its heart, was a colonial project. That's the point I would like you to keep in mind. Thank you.